Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that doesn't believe in ironing your clothes. Today we are talking about a truly exceptional creature that expands not just the roster of dragons in D&D, but recontextualizes the entirety of dragon lore in the game as a whole. The Iron Dragon. As always, today we'll be going over just exactly what an Iron Dragon is, as well as taking a deep dive into its publication history throughout the years. Then we're going to go over the Iron Dragon's lore and ecology, as well as some ways you might use this creature in a D&D campaign. And lastly, it wouldn't be a Dungeon Dad video if we didn't convert this creature into 5th edition D&D, so no matter what version of the game you enjoy, the Iron Dragon will be at your beck and call. Fair warning, we're going to get way into some deep lore involving draconic politics, 200 years of war, the death and rebirth of a god, the near eradication of several true dragon species, the actual eradication of 2 true dragon species, and a bunch of really cool facts about metallurgy. This is gonna be the biggest dragon video yet. Literally. But before we dive into all that, I want to give a massive shout out to this week's sponsor, Elisa's Guide to Magic. This supplement for 5th edition introduces a bespoke spellcasting system which allows you to create tailor-made spells with buildable effects, tactical combos, and magical teamwork, as well as a brand new system for communing with and summoning magical spirits. In Elisa's Guide to Magic, there are also a host of new player options such as the Vala Witch, who harnesses the wild nature of Vala to brew potent potions and twist malefic curses, or the Summoner, who calls forth powerful spirits and other fell creatures to aid them on and off the battlefield, the Scion, who fuels their already potent combat abilities with more Vala magic, and the Arcanologist, who crafts terrifying and wondrous contraptions, constructs, and alchemical compounds with devastating effects. There are also tons of new subclasses, all with a distinct link to the arcane. And of course, there will be dragons, a whole new brood of them, in fact. So if you want to learn how to cast powerful spells, ride a dragon, create potions and poisons, as well as unique magic items with alchemy or rune magic, this is the book for you. Be sure to check the pinned comment down below or the description beneath this video for a direct link over to the Elisa's Guide Kickstarter and check it out for yourself. So once again, thank you to Elisa's Guide to Magic and Draco Studios for bringing us here once again to talk about an ancient and forgotten dragon from D&D's past. Now, without further ado, it's time for Monster of the Week. The Iron Dragon first appeared in issue 170 of Dragon magazine in June of 1991. This issue marked the magazine's 15th anniversary and was chock full of dragon-themed content. On page 26, there was an article titled The Dragon's Bestiary, which promised some heavy metal dragons for your D&D campaign. In the article's introduction, author Jason M. Walker talks about how one of the biggest struggles he had with being a game master was he found it difficult to surprise veteran D&D players with new monsters. Enter ferrous dragons. Ferrous dragons are a topic which I've flirted with in the past on this channel, but we've never taken a proper deep dive into what they actually are. But that all changes today. Ferrous dragons are a caste of draconic creatures that fit somewhere in between chromatic and metallic dragons. While most metallic dragons are good and most chromatic dragons are evil, ferrous dragons ride the line between the two and can be good or evil, but they are always lawful. Basically, they're dragon cops. They hold to an ironclad code of law that transcends all different species of ferrous dragon kind. Originally, there were 12 ferrous dragon species that ruled the world in a vast draconic empire. However, due to infighting and a civil war that lasted centuries, at least 2 of the 12 ferrous dragon species were driven to extinction. And of the remaining 10, half of those were driven into exile. Currently, the only known living species of ferrous dragons are iron, chromium, cobalt, tungsten, and nickel dragons. And while their world-spanning empire may have long since faded to dust, these dragons still hold to the old ways and align themselves in a caste system with iron dragons sitting at the top. This is actually really similar to the concept of the Ordning, the system of organization we apply to giants in D&D, But nobody mentioned that to the dragons. They tend to get testy when giants are brought up. Something also worth mentioning about the ferrous dragons is that lumping these specific dragons under the ferrous dragon label is somewhat ironic. The word ferrous literally comes from the Latin word for iron, making a ferrous metal any metal that contains iron or iron alloys. And none of the ferrous dragons, at least none of the ones we're aware of, are named after metals that contain iron, except the Iron Dragon, of course. What's especially funny about all this to me is that steel dragons would technically be a type of ferrous dragon if we were operating on real-world metallurgy alone, but we're not, so do with that information what you will. I can only assume that the reason these dragons are called ferrous dragons is because the Iron Dragon sits at the top of their caste system. Speaking of which, let's set aside all these other mysterious dragons and talk about the star of today's show. Iron dragons are among the most powerful draconic creatures one can come across. They start life with a dull coat of mottled gray scales that gradually becomes shiny and brilliant over the course of their lifetime. Aside from the color of their scales, the signature mark of an iron dragon is the 3 horns that protrude backwards from the crown of its skull. They are highly intelligent even by draconic standards, and are just massive. To put this in perspective, most dragons hatch from an egg and at the wormling phase are about the size of a large dog. Iron dragons are born at nearly the size of a full-grown horse. And this extreme size follows them throughout their entire life, meaning that an iron great worm is bound to be among the largest of the true dragons ever. And this is only really fitting as all the other ferrous dragons bow to the Iron Dragon's rule, so I feel like they should be a little bit bigger. But I guess I should expand on that a little bit more. Each variety of ferrous dragon is broken up into smaller clans. Unlike most other true dragons, all ferrous dragons often work together and have a pretty structured society. Each of these draconic clans is led by a chief, the clan's most powerful member. These chieftains are all beholden to the sovereign of their species, who is the most powerful version of that particular dragon. This sovereign shares a telepathic link with all of the other chieftains, and this is true for each ferrous dragon species. However, sitting at the very top is the Supreme Dragon, a creature known by the name of Groglathor. Groglathor is an iron dragon said to be the progenitor of all ferrous dragons, whose age is incomprehensible to any mortal creature. Now, he shares a telepathic link with each of the sovereign dragons and expects regular reports from them in order to maintain a vast understanding of current events. It's made very clear in the text that he is not a god, but something very close. You could compare his power with that of Tiamat, queen of the chromatic dragons, or Bahamut, the lord of metallic dragons. One thing that does separate Groglathor from his metallic and chromatic peers is that he has died several times in the past. See, Groglathor is one part title and one part spiritual successor. Let me explain. When Groglathor dies, an event that happens rarely, but it can happen, his chosen successor, often the Iron Dragon Sovereign, will rise up and assume the mantle. However, this is much more than a mere political position. Groglathor's soul actually merges with the soul of his successor, effectively granting this new iteration of Groglathor all the primordial dragon's power. But it's not a replacement of the soul, it is a bonding, meaning that the power of the Iron Dragon Sovereign taking up the mantle is added to the equation. This means every time Groglathor is slain and reborn, he is just that much more powerful. So, the only way to truly destroy Groglathor would be to wipe out the entirety of the Iron Dragon species, a feat not easily done by even the most powerful entities in the cosmos. But boy, does that not stop them from trying. Iron dragons have a long-standing blood feud with red dragons. This is because the first time Groglathor was ever slain, it was at the hands or claws of a huge pack of red dragons. And with his dying breath, he swore to eradicate all red dragons from the face of the multiverse. And while he hasn't exactly been successful in this endeavor yet, to quote the source material, "Deep under a mighty mountain burns the smoldering hatred of 1,000 kings, waiting to flare into the destruction of their age-old enemies."
I am untethered and my rage knows no bounds!
And as you can imagine, Tiamat didn't take too kindly to that notion. So needless to say, iron dragons, and by extension all ferrous dragons, have an age-old hatred for all chromatic dragons, but especially red dragons. They will almost always kill each other on sight. Anything less would be considered treason by both Tiamat and Groglothor, respectively. When it comes to their relations with metallic dragons, things are definitely better, but certainly not friendly. See, iron dragons are unified by the singular goal of restoring their kingdom and rightful place atop the living creatures of the world. While they are lawful neutral creatures, the laws they abide by are laws set forth by Groglothor and the rest of dragonkind. They don't really concern themselves with the laws and affairs of basically any other species because why would they? They're dragons. To them, most other living beings are beneath them and not worth taking the time to even listen to. A human asking an iron dragon to abandon their goals of restoring the draconic rule would be like an ant asking a construction crew not to build a house because there's an anthill on the lot. As far as the dragons are concerned, you can either adapt, move, or die. It makes literally no difference to them. Metallic dragons tend to be much more sympathetic to the plight of the shorter-lived species, and the iron dragons don't much care for this ideology. They view the metallics as weak-willed and soft. I'm sure the term soy boy has been thrown around in Groglothor's chamber many a time. Soy boy! They fail to understand why a majestic dragon in all its power and glory would ever empathize, let alone cohort, with humans or one of the other humanoid races. They are especially dumbfounded by the likes of steel, copper, and silver dragons who seem to not only tolerate but actively enjoy the company of many other races. So while they certainly aren't enemies with the metallic dragons, there's not much love there either. However, once in a while their goals will align and they will fight side by side, often to subvert some chromatic dragon plot. In fact, many very powerful metallic dragons see the ferrous dragons as the key to destroying Tiamat and her chromatic dragons once and for all. But setting aside draconic politics for a moment, the iron dragons and their ferrous pals would not make another appearance for quite some time. Not until issue 356 of Dragon magazine in an article titled Ferrous Dragons: The Return of Heavy Metal Dragons. This article doesn't add a whole lot of new information, however it did update the creatures into 3rd edition D&D and give all ferrous dragons the ability to detect non-precious metals within a certain radius. They would, however, appear once again in 4th edition in both the Monster Manual 2 and the Metallic Dragon Dracnomicon, even appearing on the cover. Moving up in the world, it would seem. The 4th edition lore is kinda whatever, which is an opinion I'm sure is not that unpopular. There's no real mention or expansion of ferrous dragons, and it just kinda seems like they lumped iron dragons in with the rest of the metallic crew, which is definitely a bit more streamlined, but not quite as interesting altogether, at least in my opinion. They also moved away from them being the big badass head honchos of a former empire and put them more in the role of stealthy ambush predators, which is just completely contrary to everything we've built up about their lore until this point. I'm gonna do what a lot of people do and just ignore most of the 4th edition lore. But we did get a couple pieces of really cool new artwork, so there's that. I'm gonna touch a little bit more on the 4th edition stuff later in the video, but for now, I feel like I've been going on for quite some time about iron dragons and their history and their lore and their society, so let's take a quick break and look at what kind of abilities they actually have. In combat, this dragon has access to flight, claws, wings, and a tail, and it tends to use them much the same way as most other dragons do. But the first thing that really sets the iron dragon apart from its kin is the sheer size of the creature. As I mentioned, iron dragons are born big and they stay big for their entire life. Mechanically, this means that the iron dragon wormling is a large-sized creature instead of medium, which is more typical. This increase in size comes not only with a nice buff to hit points, but also a bump up in the physical damage inflicted by the dragon's melee attacks. Also, much like gold dragons, iron dragons possess the ability to change shape into any animal or humanoid creature they please. They don't make use of this ability often, but when they need to gather information about a humanoid society for any reason, they're liable to shift into a humanoid shape and conduct their business in the city unseen. As for their breath weapon, like many of the metallic dragons out there, they have 2 different options. The first is a cone of sleeping gas that knocks unconscious any targets who fail their saving throw. This is especially useful to the dragons for subduing intruders into their lair who can then be interrogated later. But if the dragon is feeling less merciful, it can breathe a cone of superheated sparks that deal a combination of both fire and lightning damage. This is great for bypassing resistance to a specific damage type, especially considering that fire resistance is so common. But other than their imposing size and varied breath weapons, the Iron Dragon is going to do battle in much the same way as every other large draconic creature. One thing I will mention is that the Iron Dragons are exceptionally intelligent, so any combat tricks or schemes you can come up with, the Iron Dragon is going to certainly have no problem deploying on the battlefield. It's also worth noting that Iron Dragons are typically part of that aforementioned larger draconic clan, so catching them off guard and alone is going to be a bit more difficult.
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
While they may have tremendous pride, they're also not stupid. If an Iron Dragon finds itself on the ropes against a powerful enemy, it's not going to fight to the death, it's likely going to try and escape, and then come back with reinforcements. I mentioned this in my Purple Dragon video, another unusually familial type of dragon, but anytime you have a creature of this power level that exists in a community, the potential for danger is always going to be so much higher. Because even if you manage to kill an Iron Dragon, you now have a bounty on your head which will be collected by its clan, which is bad. But should you decide to take the fight to the dragons, let's talk about all that might entail and go over the Iron Dragon's lair. Now there isn't a ton of information out there about the places that an Iron Dragon might live. The original entry lists their habitat as tropical, subtropical, temperate hills, and mountains. That's a pretty wide variety of locations, but I suppose that speaks to the versatility and adaptability of the Iron Dragon. In their 3rd edition entry, it is mentioned that Iron Dragons greedily hoard iron ore, as they can consume it for sustenance, and it is required for their reproductive cycle in some way. To what end, it's not made clear, but use your imagination. This means that they likely make their lairs in places where iron is plentiful, so mountainous regions where they can dig deep tunnels makes perfect sense. This penchant for hoarding iron does get them into conflict with dwarves on occasion. However, unless either side is particularly greedy, it is likely that some sort of agreement or mutually beneficial arrangement can be made. This also puts them in a similar biome to the ferocious red dragon, a creature that Iron Dragons will simply not abide. But assuming they are actually able to settle down, Iron Dragons are known to dig massive chambers with many interconnecting passageways between them, so that if anyone should venture into their lair, they will have an easy time sneaking up on them to defend their hoard. They've also got a few lair actions ready for any would-be intruders that I created based on some of the abilities that were given to them in later editions of the game. In 3rd edition, Iron Dragons were given the ability to cast Flesh to Stone, except instead of turning the creature into a stone statue, they would turn them into a statue made of iron. So I gave the Iron Dragon in our 5e conversion a lair action that does basically that. It works pretty much the same way as Flesh to Stone, but the target might become a lump of iron to be added to the dragon's hoard instead of rock. I also like the idea of the dragons just keeping these iron statues around. Someone exploring its lair might come across all these petrified creatures, and that could be a neat piece of decor as well as a warning to any uppity adventurers. Drawing from their ability to cast Heat Metal, also added in 3rd edition, I gave our Iron Dragon a lair action that essentially allows it to cast Heat Metal on a target or the object they're carrying, except it only lasts for a single round. In terms of regional effects, we've got a few simple, but in my opinion, very flavorful options on display here. First and foremost, the area surrounding a legendary dragon's lair is going to be ripe with iron ore deposits, even if it's not traditionally the type of place you'd expect to see iron ore. Secondly, creatures feel slow and sluggish within 10 miles of the lair. Every time you finish a long rest, you need to make a DC 10 Constitution save to avoid a level of exhaustion. You aren't denied your long rest or anything, you just might be a bit tired. This is literally just a not so subtle reference to a condition that arises when you've got too much iron in your blood. So do with that what you will. Lastly, the dragon's ability to sense non-precious metals, introduced in 3rd edition as well, appears here as a regional effect, meaning that within 25 miles of the dragon's lair, it can sense any metal and know its location. This is great for digging underground in search of more iron ore to add to its hoard, but it also means that anyone wearing armor is going to show up on this thing's radar from a pretty far distance. So if your plan is to sneak up on a legendary iron dragon, you might want to leave the armor at home, or at least invest in something made of mithril. So now that we know the history, society, lore, and ecology of the iron dragon, what it's actually capable of, and the different places it might live, let's roll all of that together and talk about some ways we can actually use this creature in our D&D campaign. Iron dragons, as a species of dragon, can fit into all your Dragony Dungeons & Dragons campaign ideas. But one thing that does set them apart and kind of provides a somewhat built-in plot is the fact that they hoard iron instead of gold or treasure. An iron hoard might not be as sexy as a giant pile of coins with a magic sword jammed in the top, but it does present a lot of logistical and far-reaching problems when you really start to think about it. Because iron is used in basically everything. Now this obviously depends on the world you are playing in, but iron is a pivotal part in the production of most metal goods. So if a dragon is hoarding vast amounts of iron, the price of everything that uses iron in its construction is going to start skyrocketing. We're talking everything from horseshoes to plate mail to door hinges. And if you happen to be playing in the Dark Sun campaign setting where iron and basically all ore is extremely scarce and nearly impossible to find, coming across an iron dragon and their hoard would be striking the jackpot of all jackpots. We're talking about a world in which a metal sword is treated the same way as like a +2 longsword is treated in regular D&D. So while I could go on about the canonical reasons why an iron dragon wouldn't appear in Dark Sun, in your version of Dark Sun, maybe it does. But as I mentioned previously, this could be especially troublesome for a dwarven community as well that runs an iron mine and relies on the metal to sell their goods and make a living. A group of adventurers driving off or slaying the dragon to regain access to those iron mines could make for a great adventure in and of itself. And if they don't want to kill the dragon, or maybe they just can't kill the dragon, perhaps they strike up some sort of deal. While iron dragons don't have much respect for humanoid species, if they can offer the dragon something it genuinely wants or needs in exchange for a portion of its iron, that might be a good deal for everybody. Keep in mind though that most iron dragons are working together with the ultimate goal of rebuilding their former kingdom. So an iron dragon isn't going to just take any deal unless it feels like it's coming out on top. The other thing to keep in mind, which may or may not be a factor, is that iron dragons have this burning generational hatred of chromatic dragons, especially the red ones. So depending on the circumstance, our group of adventurers may be able to leverage that hatred to get themselves a better deal. Maybe they're willing to help the dragon slay a more powerful red dragon, which would allow the iron dragon to move into its lair, which happens to be a mountaintop ripe with iron, leaving behind its old lair for the dwarves to make use of. This can also make the Iron Dragon an unlikely ally in the fight against chromatic dragons. While they may not be willing to help us little folk just for the sake of it, if they learn of a chromatic dragon plot, they could be convinced to help crush it, saving a few innocent lives, which is ultimately inconsequential to them, but also just happens to be why the adventurer party is interested in the first place. If an individual ever becomes especially interested in the plight of the Iron Dragons, they could even become a warlock with the Iron Dragon Sovereign, or perhaps even Groglothor as their patron. What kind of powers this Dragon Sovereign could bestow upon them remains to be seen, but I could see that playing out as a very interesting tale. And this is because, since ferrous dragons are so well organized, it opens a lot of doors to use them not just as a singular giant monster, but an institution. They would likely view any humanoid creatures willing to work with them as proper servants who know their place in the pecking order. Maybe they even grant the gift of transformation to their most loyal subjects, allowing them to become half-dragons. I could see a group of half-Iron Dragon Knights leading a pseudo-religious organization dedicated to the Iron Dragons being a really interesting force to either be a part of or interact with from the player perspective. I also do think there's a lot of potential to explore the politics of these dragons and how they interact with the various metallic species of the world. Most metallic dragons are obviously aware of the fact that they are physically superior to many other creatures, but they tend to view the strength as a gift meant to protect the realm from evil, or at the very worst, it's something to be enjoyed but not abused. Whereas the ferrous dragons see this strength as proof that they deserve to rule the world from the top. They don't necessarily want to commit evil acts or destroy other creatures, but they're also not afraid to cross that line if it means pushing their agenda. This alien way of looking at the world can be an opportunity for you as the DM to paint a picture of a nuanced, at least slightly complex villain, or even an ally with a bit more to them than just being on the same page about what's good and just. Lastly, I feel like I should talk a little bit more about the 4th edition version of this dragon's lore. In 4th edition, the Iron Dragon is described as being more of a silent shadow operative who uses espionage to gather information and get what they want. And while I don't personally find this version of their lore all that compelling, if you do, that's okay, and I encourage you to flesh that out and use it to your own ends. This style of dragon is less about ruling with an iron fist and more about wrapping everything up in an iron chain, if you get my meaning. If you want the best of both worlds, you could even set it up so there's a sort of dimorphic situation at play. Maybe some Iron Dragon clans are more predisposed to the cloak and dagger style of ruling from the shadows, and others are more along the lines of the traditional Iron Dragons from 2nd and 3rd edition. But no matter how you choose to use this dragon, I think it's a really interesting one and a worthy entry in our long and growing line of draconic creatures we've covered on this channel. If you do want to use this dragon in your game, linked in the description down below is a Google document that contains all the information and all the different age categories for the Iron Dragon and everything you will need to run it at your game table successfully. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you can find the high-res PDF Dungeon Dad Patreon style stat block, which contains all the same information, but it's presented in a much more put together way and contains the new artwork and all that stuff. Speaking of the artwork, massive shout out to this week's artist Tam for helping me bring this dragon and its wormling form to life. And speaking of patrons, a massive shout out to our patron of the week. This week's randomly selected patron is Mark E. Touchton. Thank you so much for reaching out and touching my channel with your support. I truly appreciate it. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster from an older version of D&D, Pathfinder, or some other tabletop game that you would like to see me convert into 5th edition and do a deep dive into its lore here on the channel, let me know in the comments below or over on the Dungeon Dad Discord in the Creature Suggestions chat, and who knows, you might just see it show up on an episode of Monster of the Week. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching this entire video. I'm sure it was very long. I don't know what the final runtime is going to come out to, but it feels like it's going to be a long video. If you enjoy what I do here, whether you have a monster suggestion or not, please leave a comment, let me know, and leave a like on this video. That stuff helps me out tremendously. And if this is your first time or you're just kind of new to the channel and you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing because that also helps me out a bunch. Also, if you're new, I have a bunch of other videos about cool D&D dragons that it'll show up here somewhere, a little link to that, so feel free to go over and check out all of my other dragon videos. The purple dragon seems to be a fan favorite. And I get it. Purple's a dope color. They breathe plasma. What's not to like? But in any case, one last time, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Stick around to the end for a preview of what's coming next week. Until then.
There's more than one giant that lives under the sea. These poets like nothing more than kicking back on a personal island, enjoying the peace that comes with solitude. But drama erupts when the ocean's most eligible bachelorette starts entertaining potential suitors. Next episode, Reef Giant. Tune in next time for lots more fan service.